This slide shows the basic functioning of a nerve cell, otherwise known as a neuron. You can see that in the picture. It has finger-like projections or dendrites that come off of the nerve cell. They really look like tree branches. And these dendrites receive electrical messages, and they either excite or inhibit the nerve cell. The nerve cell then will go to our target cells or in our organs and different processes in our body and either excite or inhibit those processes. The axon is a long structure. It's really like the electrical wire. It's got myelin that coats it. It's like a conductor, the myelin on the axon, and the impulse travels down that to the synapse at the nerve cell. This slide is just showing another view of that main neuron, and you can see all the axons coming down, the electrical impulses. This is probably a more accurate view. The other one's a little more animated and more cartoonish. But you can see with different diseases or abnormalities such as a stroke, when you go without oxygenated blood to an area of the brain or too much blood to an area of the brain with a hemorrhage, it blocks these impulses in this electrical circuit. Traumatic bleeding works in the same way. It either creates a volume that pushes on the nerves and they become ischemic and can't function. And like with Alzheimer's, it's a degenerative disease where these impulses at the cleft, they feel it's at that synapse, is having abnormal chemical exchanges, and you get a buildup also of the plaque that is very common in Alzheimer's, and that inhibits the neuronal impulse from occurring. So this is all kind of the basic unit when we're assessing patients and we see abnormalities. This is where it all starts from, the dysfunction that's occurring in that patient. In this slide, we're just going to start going over some of the functions of the upper brain, and the cerebrum is the other name for that upper main structure in the brain. You have a right side and a left side, but each side has the same lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. And we're going to go into their functions in a little bit more detail in the next slides. But also you see that cauliflower-like structure in the lower part underneath the cerebrum. That is your cerebellum. It plays a role with balance and coordination. It's pretty big. And when you feel the back of your skull and that kind of bony structure, that knob, it's really sitting in that area. And then the other things you just start to see here are the brainstem and the cranial nerves, which we're going to go into more detail of both of those structures in the next slides. Okay, the image on this slide is a little better. It's more of a 3D image, and that's actually what the brain will look like. It's made of the outer cortex layer is gray matter. The internal structure is white matter. And then you have your cerebellum, and you can see peeking out there on the bottom is the brainstem. But just as a review, and we'll go into these in a little bit more depth, you have your frontal lobes. Remember, they're on the right and left side. These really help control personality, long-term memory, more executive thinking. It was really part of the brain that evolved last, and that's why we have large frontal lobes. You always hear about that, and why humans are supposedly why they have more complex thought. You have the parietal lobes, which are really on the sides of the brain. It's really pointing to the right side there, but on the right and left side. And those are really sensory integration. So what does that mean? It means when I touch a key, I can tell it's a key without even looking at it. I can pick up a brush and recognize what it is and know what it's supposed to do. So the parietal lobe really processes our sensory information into our brain. The temporal lobe, you have right and left. Again, its really main functions are hearing, things like short-term memory. You actually process your hearing on the opposite side of the impulses that come in. So say you hear something mainly in your right ear, you process it on the other side of your brain, on the left temporal lobe. And then you see in the back that's cerebellum. That's really for balance and coordination. So when you see the doctors have the patient stand and close their eyes and look to see if they waver side to side, they're really looking at that balance structure. The other thing you'll see them do is flap their hands back and forth on their thighs, things like that. It's all looking at coordination and balance. Okay, with this slide, it's that same 3D model, but now you can see the underneath part. And I like to show this, and we have the base of the skull in that picture, the dish. That's the bottom of your skull, and that's where your brain sits. If you think of it as sitting on a plate. And you have things called fossas, and I'll show you those little dips in that plate of your skull where your brain will sit. You can see really good with this one, the cerebellum and the brainstem coming out of the base of the brain, but you can see how the brainstem really goes up into the center of the structure there. Things to take note, see that circle in the base of the skull there? It's called the foramen magnum, and that's where your brainstem exits your skull and becomes your spinal cord. And this is important when you look at all those sharp edges where the brainstem goes through. When you have problems like herniation or things taking up too much room in your skull, it starts to push on those edges and you can run into problems with structure. The next one is that, see the dish, that's where the next arrow is pointing to. It's also called a fossa. And you can see how those temporal lobes are just going to fit right into that fossa. And when you have things like a basilar skull fracture, you have little vessels there, your covering of your dura that covers your brain. It can fracture that base of the skull, and you can get certain symptoms of bleeding, certain assessment findings that are particular to that kind of fracture. And pointing to these little holes, that's where all your cranial nerves exit your skull. So your cranial nerves sit all along your brainstem and then go out those little holes down to wherever they're going to function, whether it's your face, your lifting of your shoulders, sticking out your tongue, all kinds of things, and we'll go over them in more detail. But just so you can see where they go out on the base of the skull. It's a pretty important structure. Okay, so let's look at some major functions of that upper part of the brain that sits on top of the brainstem. The other name for it is the cerebrum. You can see that written in textbooks, so it's just an interchangeable name for that upper structure which has all the lobes in it. So the lobes have specific functions that have been identified, and that really helps us when we're doing assessments because we can tell where the infarction, the stroke, the tumor, the bleeding is occurring. So one of the first major areas is Broca's area. It's one of the two known speech areas. The Broca's area sits in the front of the brain, and it really controls motor speech. So our ability to say and articulate what we want to say, moving our mouth, the muscles, everything that goes along with that. In the back of the brain is Wernicke's area. So that's the sensory speech area. So we have a sensory and a motor speech area. The sensory area, Wernicke's, is in the back of the brain. It's really in the temporal lobe, temporal parietal lobe there. And it is our ability to understand speech, to be able to process the speech. So those two really work together to be able to understand what somebody is saying and to be able to say something back. So when we have patients with aphasias after a stroke, and maybe they understand what we're saying but can't speak back to us and say what they want to say, that would be a motor speech deficit or a Broca's area. So some kind of infarction in the front of the brain. In the back, they wouldn't be able to understand what we're saying. It's a receptive aphasia. And I have a trick for remembering where these are. Broca's area starts with the B. It's in the front of the alphabet. It sits in the front of the brain. Wernicke's starts with the W. It's in the back of the alphabet, and it's in the back of the brain. So it's just a way I can remember that. Up on the top, you see that central sulcus. It's really a fold that divides those two areas, the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. And that really is where information comes up our spinal cord tracts. Maybe we feel something hot, or we have something that we have touched, and the information comes up to that somatosensory cortex, transfers over to the motor cortex, and then we have a planned motor response. So we feel a comb, the touch of the feel comes up to that sensory cortex, processes over to a motor, and we have a motor response of combing our hair. So those two really work together. If we see patients with certain seizures, every part of that motor and sensory strip has a certain part of the body that it controls. So it helps neurologists to know where the seizure focus is, if they can see just what part of the body is affected with the seizure activity. Okay, in the back, this is interesting, the visual association area is in the occipital lobe, way in the back of the brain. So when we think of vision, we have the optic nerves in the front of the eye. It's a pretty complex pathway getting all the way to the back where we interpret what we see. So somebody can actually be blind because they can't interpret any of the impulses that come in their eyes. So anybody that has an injury towards the back of the brain or an infarction may have trouble with vision, and it's all because they can't interpret the visual impulses coming in through the optic nerve. The prefrontal area is an area where more complex thought, personality, higher functioning occurs. So patients that have frontal lobe trauma or infarction may have trouble with the higher complex thought or calculations, or even some of personality problems are thought to originate from the prefrontal area. That area, we think, plays a role in inhibition of behavior. So some criminal activity is actually thought to have some problems with the prefrontal area because you can't inhibit the impulses, and thus maybe promote some criminal type activities. That's just a theory, but it helps to remember that area. Okay, now this is just a kind of a nice drawing, remembering that left brain, right brain have different overall functions themselves. And, you hear people say, oh, I'm left-brained or I'm right-brained. Right brain is thought to be more creative, artistic, more sensory thoughts to it, where the left brain is more analytical, science, math, and logic. So when you think about strokes, though, if somebody has a primary stroke on the left side, they are going to have, number one, speech problems, because those speech centers I showed you, the Wernicke's and Broca's, are only on the left side of the brain. So if they have a problem on the left side of the brain, they're going to have speech problems more than likely. And also their calculation and reason will be impaired. Right side of the brain, you may see more emotional problems. They have problems controlling emotions, because this side of the brain, as you can see, is much more involved in abstract kind of thoughts. Okay, now let's look at the brainstem. The brainstem sits below the cerebrum. It's got three main portions. This is where all the cranial nerves come out of, and really the function of the cranial nerves can really correlate to the different part of the brainstem where they come out of, and it's a way to help remember those functions. It's got three main parts, and really you can't live without the brainstem functioning. So if you have any patients that have trauma to the brainstem or stroke in the brainstem, it can be really a poor prognosis because of its vital functions. So the top portion is the midbrain. It connects to the cerebrum, and it has some important functions with vision, hearing, the sleep-awake cycle, arousal, which is really the ability to wake up. So that's our level of consciousness. So when we're charting level of consciousness of our patient, we're really looking at midbrain function. And it also works closely with the hypothalamus for temperature control. There is a structure in it. It's really a group of nuclei that go throughout the brainstem, but it's called the reticular activating system. And that's really with that sleep, awake, and arousal cycle. So being able to wake up quickly and be aware of what's going on in our environment and conscious, and being able to fall asleep. So when people lose consciousness, when they have a blow to the head, they think it's a jarring of this reticular activating system. And people, as they go into a comatose state or as their injury to their brain progresses, the reticular activating system has more difficulty functioning. The next section is the pons. The pons has cranial nerves that come out and help control eye movements. When we do the look up, look down, look side to side, that's looking at the cranial nerves that control that. Also facial expressions, when we say smile and we're looking at symmetry on both sides of the face. So it has cranial nerves that come out that help control facial expression, and importantly controls breathing. So when you have a patient that's starting to have brainstem involvement, they get abnormal breathing patterns, Cheyne-Stokes breathing, apneustic breathing, and that's all because the pons is starting to be affected. The lowest section is the medulla. The medulla has some pretty important things. Respiratory center, so it's working with the pons. When you get more abnormal breathing patterns, less regularity to the irregular patterns, it's the medulla that's starting to be affected. Importantly too, this is where the motor pathways, when we're going to talk about those, the spinal cord pathways, the things that control our movements, it crisscrosses here. So remember we talked about the motor strip in the brain, that really comes down to the spinal cord, but it crosses over in the medulla. So this is why a patient that has a stroke on the right side of their brain has left-sided weakness, and vice versa. Stroke on the left side, they have right-sided weakness because of the crisscrossing of those motor pathways. And then another important function is the cardiac. So when you have involvement with the medulla, you start having cardiac dysrhythmias, and eventually, it will control the heart, and the heart wouldn't be able to function at all. So some pretty important things that go along with the brainstem, and that's why the cranial nerve assessment is so important in our head to toe with a focus assessment in neuro.